This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is In the Tall Grass, which recently premiered on Netflix. It was directed by Vincenzo Natali and from a story by Joe Hill. I believe Joe Hill and Stephen King wrote the novella. And this is a fascinating movie, but there's some caveats, and I'll go into that. Vincenzo Natali, the first film I was aware of his was 1997's Cube. And that was brilliant. And it involved around 4 or 5 people trapped in this space. They didn't know how they got there. They didn't know what they had done to deserve to be there. And they had no control over what was going on around them. They only come to know that there was a certain logic to it. It wasn't random by any stretch of the imagination. And it was definitely something constructed by man. And for the 2002 sequel to Cube, which is Cube Hypercube, Vincenzo Natali not only didn't come back, as far as I'm aware, he had no connection to that movie. Now I mention that because with Cube Hypercube, it revolved around a more theoretical construct. In the first Cube, it was an actual physical object. With Hypercube, it was a theoretical construct. It didn't exist in this dimension. Why do I mention those two movies? Well, because In the Tall Grass, and keep in mind something, I haven't read the Stephen King / Joe Hill story that is the basis of this movie, so I can't comment on that. Though I can say I've read a story or two from Joe Hill. Not a fan. But that being said, In the Tall Grass actually plays like Cube Hypercube. I'm not saying it's the same thing by any stretch of the imagination, but in the broad strokes, they are remarkably similar in that you have a space in which people are trapped, in which time is no longer linear, in which you can have multiple selves moving about, doing things, at the same time you're moving about and doing things. It's an interesting premise. Also, I should mention is that this actually plays like a sequel to Pet Sematary, oddly enough, if only because the dead walk in both places, just by different means, but the same thing. And they're both linked by a reference to people who were here before us. In Pet Sematary, I believe it was Micmac Indians, and here you don't know who they are. Well, at least I should say in the movie, you don't know who they are. But you get a hint of people older than us being present and being caught up in these events as well. And so, In the Tall Grass is a fascinating movie. It's thought-provoking and it's bold, extremely bold. Why is that? First off, as I mentioned, it's directed by Vincenzo Natali. And second off, it doesn't use typical devices to tell its story. For instance, in most other movies, you would probably get an info dump at some point telling you why things are happening, what's causing it. And to be totally honest with you, I'd be more comfortable with that. It's what I'm accustomed to seeing. But Vincenzo Natali does not do that. Events unspool, things happen, people die. But you don't quite know why they are happening necessarily. And in other directors, I'd actually be critical of that. But there are no accidents here. Natali is deliberately not spoon-feeding you narrative, in a sense that he's not going to explain how that rock got there. Though oddly enough, it reminded me of a Fix song, Walkabout. Listen to it, it's actually pretty cool. In any case, he's not going to spoon-feed you narrative. Events are going to happen. Events are going to proceed logically, but you're not necessarily going to get every little question answered. Though I have a question, speaking of which. As I mentioned earlier, the movie revolves around this field of grass, i.e. In the Tall Grass. And in this space, time is, I wouldn't say suspended, but it's on a different track. Distance is on a different track. It's its own pocket universe, if you will. And there's a scene earlier in the movie where I I think her name is Beth, but I'm not 100% about that. In any case, she's going to cross over into the grass, and she notices a book, Jane Eyre, and that's her book. Now, I would have liked it better if she'd shown some indication of at least recognizing the book or the writer, but in any case, that book was left there, and then she entered the tall grass. Travis came later and noticed the book and picked it up, and then her name was on the first page. So what that seems to imply to me is that events are repeating. So events are repeating outside the tall grass. Does that mean its influence is extending? I'm not entirely sure. I don't think so. But at the same time, that book should not have been there because she was the only person who could have dropped it, being it was her book. So if the grass isn't extending its influence, how's that book there? But conversely, if the grass is extending its influence, why aren't there more cars parked in that lot across the street where the church is? Keep in mind that, as I mentioned, the grass, the field plays with time, and you have multiples of individuals, of the same individuals, running around that field. And so it would make sense to me that those multiples had to enter the field at some point. So therefore, you should have more than one car that they drove to get there. Now, the short story may have answered that question, but it seemed very odd to me that there was only one car that belonged to the brother and sister, but not at least two of the exact same cars, because there were other versions of them in the field, and those versions had to get there somehow. So that's a little bit of a, I don't know if that's a mistake. As I said, I haven't read the novella that this movie is based on, and maybe that's covered there. But it seemed kind of out of whack. But on the whole, In the Tall Grass is clever, it's thought-provoking, it's interesting, and it's definitely a horror movie, but it's not the type of horror you're typically used to. As I said, it doesn't telegraph its intentions. It doesn't tell you where it's going. You can kind of tell, but it's not going to give you much heads up before it does it. And only a masterful filmmaker could do that, and that is Vincenzo Natali. Check out In the Tall Grass. It's on Netflix. Really good movie, an interesting movie, but don't go in thinking you know where it's going or where it's going to end up, because you probably don't. This is Brian with ScreenFells.com and Review. Peace.